You just cook. That was what Bianca always said. Like flour under her fingernails made Maddie something less than human. Bianca said it the morning she walked into their grandmother's kitchen with a stranger in a $2,000 suit and a leather folder full of numbers that didn't belong to her. Maddie didn't know yet that the man drinking black coffee in the corner booth, the one everyone in town pretended not to notice, was about to make sure that folder never left the building. The kitchen at Rosa's kitchen smelled like browned butter and cracked pepper at 5 in the morning, the way it had smelled every single morning for the 11 years since Maddie was old enough to stand on a step stool and stir. She was 22 now, tall enough that she didn't need the stool anymore, but some mornings she still reached for it out of habit before catching herself and laughing quietly at the ghost of the girl she used to be. The diner sat on the corner of 9th and Larkspur, a squat brick building with a faded green awning and a neon sign that buzzed a half-second before it lit, a detail regulars had grown fond of, the way people grow fond of a stutter in someone they love. Maddie moved through the kitchen with the practiced economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She cracked eggs one-handed. She rendered bacon fat low and slow. She pulled the biscuit dough out of the walk-in exactly 40 minutes before service so it would proof at the right temperature. Every motion was inherited. Her grandmother, Rosa Sullivan, had built this diner out of a converted auto shop in 1979 with a cast iron skillet, a mortgage she couldn't afford, and a notebook of recipes she guarded like scripture. Rosa had died 3 years ago, but the notebook lived on in a fireproof box under the register, and its contents lived in Maddie's hands. That was the thing nobody in her family seemed to understand. The recipes weren't just instructions, they were muscle memory, timing, the exact moment you pulled a roux off the heat before it turned bitter. You couldn't hand someone a piece of paper and expect them to reproduce 40 years of a dead woman's instinct. But apparently, to Bianca, you could sell that instinct for $5 million and never once ask the person who actually carried it in her hands. Bianca Sullivan was 28, 6 years older than Maddie, and had spent most of those 6 years making it clear that she considered the diner beneath her. She'd left for business school the day she turned 18 and hadn't looked back except to visit twice a year. Always dressed like she was interviewing for a job she already had. Always talking about margins and scalability and legacy brands. Like Rosa's Kitchen was a startup, instead of a place where widowers came every Sunday because the pancakes reminded them of their wives. Bianca had a talent for making Maddie feel small in exactly 4 words. "You just cook," she'd say, whenever Maddie tried to weigh in on anything that touched the business side of things. "You just cook, Maddie. Let the adults handle the money." Maddie had swallowed that phrase so many times over the years, it had practically become part of her own vocabulary, a little bruise she pressed on without meaning to. She told herself it didn't matter. She loved the work. She loved the 6 a.m. quiet before the first customers arrived, the smell of coffee blooming through the dining room, the particular satisfaction of watching someone close their eyes on the first bite of Rosa's cornbread and go somewhere far away in their memory. That was worth more to her than any conference room Bianca had ever sat in. At least, that was what she told herself. Right up until the Tuesday morning she walked in early to prep and found her sister sitting in the corner booth with a man Maddie had never seen before. Both of them hunched over a laptop, a leather portfolio open on the table between them with the words Sullivan Culinary IP License printed across the top in a font too clean and too corporate to belong anywhere near Rosa's cracked linoleum floor. Maddie stopped in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, her apron still tied loosely around her waist, a bag of flour forgotten in her arms. Bianca's voice carried easily in the empty diner, that same crisp, rehearsed cadence she used when she wanted to sound like she'd already won an argument nobody else knew they were having. "The valuation is conservative," Bianca was saying to the man across from her. We're talking 60 years of regional brand equity, a cult following, 4 generations of word-of-mouth marketing you couldn't buy for love or money. 5 million is a floor, not a ceiling, Mr. Vance. Once we scale the recipes into a packaged product line, national distribution, we're looking at 10 times that within 3 years. The man, Preston Vance, had the kind of tan that came from a bottle and a smile that came from a mirror. He nodded along, clicking a pen against the edge of the table. And you have full authority to license the recipes? No other family stakeholders we need in the room? Bianca didn't hesitate. I'm the eldest. It's my name on the trust documents. There's no complication. Maddie's stomach dropped through the floor. The bag of flour slipped an inch in her arms before she caught it. Her grandmother's notebook, the one in the fireproof box, the one with Rosa's careful cursive fading at the edges from 40 years of flour-dusted fingers turning its pages, was not Bianca's to license to anyone. It belonged to the family. It belonged, if it belonged to anyone specifically, to the person who had spent every single day since Rosa's funeral making sure the recipes stayed alive in a kitchen instead of dying in a drawer. It belonged to Maddie. She set the flour down on the counter so quietly it barely made a sound, and she walked into the dining room with her chin up, even though her hands had started to shake. "What is this?" Maddie asked. Bianca's head snapped up. For half a second, something flickered across her sister's face, something close to guilt, and then it hardened back into the composed mask Bianca wore like armor. "Maddie, you're early." "I'm always early. I open the kitchen." Maddie's eyes moved to the leather folder, to the words printed across the top, to the little chrome laptop with a spreadsheet full of numbers she didn't recognize and didn't want to. "What is Sullivan Culinary IP license, Bianca?" Preston Vance stood up, extending a hand with the smooth confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no and meant it. "You must be the sister. Preston Vance, Vance Capital Partners. We're so excited about what Bianca's building here." Maddie didn't take his hand. "What is she building exactly?" "A licensing deal," Preston said, either not noticing or not caring about the tension crackling in the air. "Bianca's putting together a package to sell the Rosa Sullivan recipe archive to a national food conglomerate. Frozen breakfast lines, boxed mixes, the whole 9 yards. 5 million up front, royalties on the back end. It's a fantastic opportunity for the family." Maddie looked at her sister. "You're selling Nona's recipes." "I'm monetizing an asset that's been sitting dormant for 3 years, Bianca said, and there was an edge in her voice now, the edge Maddie remembered from every argument they'd ever had, the tone that said Bianca had already decided she was right and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. "This diner brings in what, maybe $80,000 a year in profit, if we're lucky?" "I'm talking about $5 million, Maddie. That's not dormant. That's generational wealth. That's Mom never worrying about her hip surgery bills again. That's you never having to stand over a griddle at 5 in the morning for the rest of your life." "I like standing over the griddle," Maddie said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's the whole point. That's not a burden you're rescuing me from, Bianca. That's my life. That's what Nona built." "Nona's dead," Bianca said flatly, and the words landed in the empty dining room like a dropped plate. "The recipes don't mean anything to her anymore. They mean something to whoever's smart enough to turn them into money before they mean nothing to anyone." Maddie felt something cold settle behind her ribs. She had absorbed a lot of things from her sister over the years, the dismissiveness, the dinner table lectures about practicality, the endless, "you just cook," but she had never once thought Bianca would try to take the one thing in this world that was actually, unquestionably, entirely Maddie's to protect. "You don't have the authority to do this," Maddie said. "The recipes are in Nona's estate. You know that. You were at the reading of the will, same as me. The will left the diner to both of us jointly, Bianca said. The recipes are diner property. I have every legal right to license diner assets. Then I'll fight you on it, Maddie said. And for the first time in her life, she meant it with her whole chest. No hesitation, no folding, no swallowing the words down to keep the peace. Preston Vance cleared his throat, glancing between the two sisters with the mild discomfort of a man watching a business deal turn into a family feud he hadn't budgeted the emotional energy for. Ladies, perhaps we table this for— There's nothing to table, Bianca snapped, not looking away from Maddie. The deal closes Friday. I already signed the letter of intent. The bell over the front door chimed. Maddie didn't turn around right away. She was too busy staring at her sister, too busy feeling the floor tilt slightly under her feet at the words, letter of intent, at the casual, surgical way Bianca had said them, like she'd already carved Maddie out of the picture entirely and simply hadn't bothered to mention it until the knife was already in. But she heard the diner go quiet in that particular way it always did when Enzo Castellano walked in. It wasn't loud quiet. Nobody gasped. Nobody stared too obviously. But conversations dipped half a register. Silverware slowed against plates, and the two line cooks visible through the kitchen pass window both straightened up a little, the way people did around someone whose presence rearranged the air in a room without him ever having to say a word. Enzo had been coming to Rosa's kitchen for almost a year now, always around the same time, always ordering the same thing, always sitting in the corner booth by the window with his back to the wall and a clear line of sight to the door. He never made trouble. He tipped generously and paid in cash and left before the morning rush thickened into chaos. Most of the regulars in town knew exactly who he was, or knew enough not to ask questions, and they had all, quietly, collectively decided that as long as he kept ordering the 2 eggs over easy and the buttermilk biscuits, and never raised his voice, it wasn't their business what he did with the rest of his day. Maddie knew who he was too, in the vague, second-hand way small towns pass along information nobody wants to say too loudly. Enzo Castellano ran things. Nobody was ever more specific than that. He owned a logistics company down by the port that everyone assumed was a front for something else. He had a standing table at the Italian restaurant across town that closed early whenever he showed up unannounced. And there was a story, unconfirmed but persistent, that a man had once tried to shake down half the businesses on Larkspur Street for protection money, and had simply stopped bothering anyone in this particular town within the week. Maddie had never asked him about any of it. In her kitchen, he was just a quiet man in an expensive coat who liked his eggs cooked a certain way, and always noticed when she'd changed the seasoning on the hash browns, even by a fraction. He was standing just inside the door now, dark wool coat still buttoned against the early chill, his eyes moving over the scene in front of him with the unhurried, assessing calm of a man who had walked into 100 rooms mid-crisis and never once needed to raise his voice to understand exactly what was happening in them. He was not a large man in the way some of the men Maddie had heard described in whispered gossip were large. He was lean and precise, dark hair combed back, a faint gray at his temples that made him look less like a young man playing at power, and more like someone who had earned every gray hair honestly. His eyes were a deep, unreadable brown, and right now they were fixed on the leather folder still sitting open on the table between Bianca and Preston Vance. "Am I interrupting something?" Enzo asked. His voice was low, unhurried, faintly accented in a way that suggested he'd grown up somewhere his parents still called the old country, even after decades away from it. "We're finishing up," Bianca said quickly, reaching to close the folder. "Family business." "It didn't sound like family business," Enzo said. He walked further into the dining room, unbuttoning his coat, and slid into his usual booth without waiting to be shown to it. It sounded like a business transaction someone forgot to tell their family about. Bianca's jaw tightened. I'm sorry, do we know you? Everyone in this town knows me, Miss Sullivan, Enzo said pleasantly, and there was something in the way he said it, unbothered, almost amused, that made Preston Vance visibly shift his weight from one foot to the other. I've been eating breakfast here 5 days a week for the better part of a year. I know the woman who cooks it better than I know most of my own associates. His eyes moved to Maddie, and something in his expression softened by a fraction, an almost imperceptible shift that Maddie felt more than saw. Good morning, Maddie. Morning, Maddie said, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. Enzo's gaze slid back to the folder on the table, to the words printed across the top of it. He read them upside down without any apparent effort, the way a man reads a menu he's already memorized. Sullivan Culinary IP License, he said slowly, like he was tasting the words and finding them slightly off. That's an interesting document to be signing in the same building where the woman whose name is on it is standing 3 feet away, looking like she just found out about it. Preston Vance forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This really is a private matter, sir. I don't believe we've been introduced. No, Enzo agreed. We haven't. He didn't offer his name. He simply looked at Preston with an expression of mild, patient interest, the kind a man might give an insect he hadn't yet decided whether to flick off the table or study a little longer. Preston Vance, Vance Capital Partners. You people have a reputation. Something flickered across Preston's face, a small crack in the composed veneer. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean you buy up small family businesses, strip out anything with resale value, and leave the rest to rot, Enzo said, still perfectly pleasant, still perfectly calm, in a way that somehow made the words land harder than if he'd shouted them. I've seen the pattern before. A bakery in the 5th Ward, a hardware store on Delancey, both gone within 18 months of signing with your firm. You're not investing in this diner, Mr. Vance. You're strip mining it. Bianca stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. With all due respect, sir, this is a legal, legitimate business transaction, and I don't know why you feel entitled to weigh in on it. Enzo looked at her for a long moment. It wasn't an unkind look, exactly, but there was something in it that made Bianca's confident posture waver, just slightly, the way a flame wavers when a door opens somewhere in the house. I feel entitled to weigh in, Enzo said, because I have significant financial interest in the businesses along this street, including this one, and because a $5 million deal closing this Friday without full stakeholder consent isn't just a family disagreement, Miss Sullivan. It's a legal liability I'd very much like to understand before it becomes my problem, too. Maddie blinked. Financial interest. She hadn't known that. As far as she'd ever been told, Rosa's Kitchen was independently owned, mortgage paid off years before Maddie was even born. No investors, no silent partners, nothing but Rosa's stubbornness and 40 years of regulars keeping the lights on. She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, and then closed it again, some instinct telling her this wasn't the moment. I don't know what you're talking about, Bianca said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Then let me explain it plainly, Enzo said. He folded his hands on the table, unhurried, the posture of a man settling in for a conversation he had no intention of rushing. 3 years ago, when your grandmother's health started failing and this diner's finances got tight enough that the bank started sending letters she didn't want to open, I bought the note on this building. Quietly, through a holding company, because I didn't want a woman who'd spent 40 years building something with her own 2 hands to feel like she owed her existence to a stranger in a suit. Rosa knew. She came to me herself, in fact, after she found out who held the paper. We had an understanding. His eyes moved briefly to Maddie, and something in them was almost gentle. She wanted to make sure this place would still be standing for her granddaughter, whichever granddaughter earned it. I told her I'd see to it. The dining room had gone very still. Maddie felt something rising in her throat, thick and unexpected, some combination of shock and grief and a strange, disbelieving warmth. Her grandmother had never mentioned any of this. Rosa had died believing, apparently, that she'd quietly arranged a safety net for the diner without ever burdening her granddaughters with the knowledge of how close they'd come to losing it. "That's not possible," Bianca said, though her voice had gone thin. "There's no lien on this property. I checked the records myself before I structured this deal." "The records are held under a holding company called Adriatic Ventures," Enzo said. "You'd have had to know to look for it. I imagine you didn't." He paused, and for the first time something harder entered his expression. A shift so subtle Maddie nearly missed it, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop half a degree in response. "Which means, Miss Sullivan, that any deal licensing this diner's intellectual property to a third party requires my sign-off as a stakeholder in the underlying business. You don't have it. You never asked for it, and I'm telling you now, in front of your sister and your business partner, that you don't have it and you won't be getting it." Preston Vance was already reaching for the leather folder, sliding it closed with the smooth efficiency of a man who had decided very quickly that this deal was no longer worth whatever commission he'd been promised. "Bianca, I think we need to revisit the structure of this before Friday." "Preston, wait." "I'll call you," Preston said, already standing, already buttoning his jacket. He didn't look at Enzo again, didn't say goodbye, just moved toward the door with the brisk, apologetic walk of a man exiting a burning building he'd helped set on fire. The bell chimed sharply behind him. Bianca stood alone in the middle of the dining room, the folder now closed on the table in front of her, her face flushed with an anger that Maddie recognized because she'd spent her whole life on the receiving end of it, dressed up as certainty and control, and only ever cracking open, rarely, to reveal how much of it was actually fear. "You had no right," Bianca said, her voice shaking now, directed at Enzo but her eyes flicking to Maddie every few seconds, like she couldn't decide who she was angrier at. "You had no right to interfere in a family matter." "I didn't interfere in a family matter," Enzo said calmly. "I protected an investment. The fact that it also happens to protect your sister's inheritance is, from where I'm sitting, a fairly good outcome for everyone, except you and Mr. Vance." "This is my inheritance too," Bianca snapped. "I have just as much right to that notebook as she does." "You have a right to a share of the diner's value," Enzo said. "You do not have the right to unilaterally sell off the one thing that makes this place worth anything at all, without asking the person who spent every day for 3 years keeping it alive." He looked at Maddie then, and his voice, when he continued, softened just slightly, though it lost none of its weight. "I've watched your sister run this kitchen for the better part of a year now, Miss Sullivan. 5 in the morning, 6 days a week, through 2 burst pipes, a walk-in freezer that died in July, and a health inspector who clearly had a personal vendetta against the biscuit recipe. She rebuilt the breakfast menu from memory after a grease fire destroyed half your grandmother's handwritten notes. She has never once, in the time I've been coming here, complained about any of it." He turned back to Bianca. "That's not nothing. That's not just cooking. That's a business asset with a face and a name, and you tried to sell it out from under her for $5 million without so much as a phone call." Maddie felt her throat tighten. She hadn't known he'd noticed any of that. She hadn't known anyone had noticed any of that, not really. Not the burst pipes at 2 in the morning, or the nights she'd sat on the kitchen floor with Rosa's fire-damaged notebook, trying to reconstruct the cornbread ratio from taste memory alone, crying quietly into her sleeve because it felt like losing her grandmother all over again. Bianca's face had gone pale. For a long moment, she didn't say anything at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its polish entirely, cracked open into something rawer and younger, something that sounded almost like the sister Maddie remembered from before business school, before the 4-word dismissals, before the distance grew so wide neither of them knew how to close it anymore. "I just wanted to be good at something," Bianca said quietly. "You were always good at this. The kitchen, Nona, all of it. I was never good at any of it. I burned water. I thought if I could bring in the money instead, if I could be good at that, it would count for something." Maddie stared at her sister, feeling something complicated twist in her chest. Anger and pity tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other. "You could have just asked me, Bianca. You could have told me you felt like that instead of trying to sell Nona's whole life's work behind my back." "I know," Bianca said, and for the first time in longer than Maddie could remember, she actually sounded like she meant it. "I know that now." Enzo watched the exchange without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though Maddie caught something in his eyes that might have been quiet approval, the look of a man who preferred to let a fire burn itself down to something manageable before deciding whether it needed to be put out entirely. "The letter of intent," Enzo said finally, breaking the silence. "I'll need you to rescind it in writing by end of day. I'll have my attorney send over the language." Bianca nodded slowly, some of the fight visibly draining out of her. "Fine." "And Miss Sullivan," Enzo added, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it now. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're bad at everything. I think you're very good at exactly the wrong thing, applied to exactly the wrong place. There's a difference." Bianca let out a short, humorless laugh, wiping quickly at the corner of her eye before either of them could see whether it was actually a tear. "That's supposed to be comforting?" "It's supposed to be true," Enzo said simply. Bianca gathered the folder, the laptop, her coat, moving with the stiff, careful motions of someone trying to hold themselves together through sheer will. At the door, she paused, looking back at Maddie with an expression that was harder to read than any Maddie had seen on her sister's face in years. Something raw and unformed, not quite an apology, but the shape of where one might eventually grow. "I'll come by Sunday," Bianca said. "We should talk. Actually talk, I mean. Not like this." "Okay," Maddie said quietly. "Sunday." The bell chimed once more, and then the diner was quiet again, just the low hum of the refrigerator case and the distant clatter of the line cooks resuming their work in the kitchen, pretending, with the practiced discretion of good staff everywhere, that they hadn't heard a word of what had just happened. Maddie stood in the middle of the dining room for a long moment, her heart still hammering, the adrenaline of the last 10 minutes draining out of her all at once and leaving something shaky and hollow in its place. She looked at Enzo, who had settled back into his booth like nothing unusual had happened at all, unfolding the newspaper he always brought with him and smoothing it flat against the table. "You bought the diner," Maddie said. It wasn't quite a question. "I bought the note," Enzo corrected mildly. "There's a difference. I've never once collected on it, and I never intended to. Your grandmother paid ahead of schedule every quarter for 3 years. She was a stubborn woman." "She never told me any of that." "She didn't want you to feel like you owed anyone anything," Enzo said. "She wanted you to feel like this place was yours because you earned it, not because a man in a suit decided to be generous." He looked up at her, and something in his expression made her chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger or grief. "For what it's worth, she was right. You did earn it." Maddie swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden, unexpected sting behind her eyes. "Why didn't you say anything before now? You've been coming here for a year." "Because it wasn't my place to interfere in family business," Enzo said, "until family business became a $5 million transaction that threatened to hand your grandmother's legacy to a man who'd have gutted it for parts within 18 months. That I felt entitled to weigh in on." "You could have just told me you owned the note. Any of the last 360-some mornings you've sat in that booth." A faint, almost private smile touched the corner of his mouth. I could have. I preferred watching you build something worth protecting first. It made the eggs taste better, knowing I wasn't just funding a business. I was funding you. Maddie didn't know what to say to that. She stood there with flour still dusting the hem of her apron, her sister's betrayal still ringing in her ears, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest that she didn't have a name for yet, not one she was ready to say out loud. "Your eggs are getting cold," she said finally, nodding toward the kitchen. "I should—" "Go," Enzo said, waving a hand, though his eyes stayed on her a beat longer than necessary before he looked back down at his newspaper. "I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed felt strange in the particular way days feel strange after a near miss, like the ground had tilted slightly and hadn't quite settled back into place. Maddie kept expecting to feel triumphant, or at least relieved, and instead she mostly felt tired, the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has spent years absorbing small cruelties without naming them and has finally, belatedly, had to look directly at the size of the wound. She threw herself into the work the way she always did, because the work didn't ask questions and didn't require her to have feelings she wasn't ready to sort through yet. She made biscuits before dawn. She restocked the walk-in. She trained the new line cook, a quiet, earnest kid named Marcus who kept scorching the hash browns and apologizing for it like the diner might collapse if the potatoes weren't perfect. Preston Vance did not go quietly. 2 days after the confrontation in the dining room, Maddie arrived at the diner before sunrise to find the front window had been egged sometime overnight, a sticky yellow smear dripping down the glass in the shape of something that might have been an accident and might not have been. She scrubbed it off herself before opening, telling herself it was probably teenagers, telling herself it didn't mean anything, even as a small, cold knot of unease settled into her stomach and refused to leave. The following afternoon, during the slow stretch between lunch and dinner, 2 men she didn't recognize came in and sat at the counter. They didn't order much. Coffee, a slice of pie neither of them touched. They asked a lot of questions that sounded casual and weren't, about who owned the diner, whether the recipes were trademarked, whether Maddie had ever considered how much easier her life would be if she just took the money and let someone else handle the headache of running a small business in a tough economy. One of them, a heavy-set man with a gold ring on every finger, leaned across the counter as Maddie refilled his coffee and said, low enough that the other customers wouldn't hear, that it would be a real shame if a place like this had trouble with its health permits, or its insurance, or its fire inspections. He said it with a smile, the kind of smile that was worse than a scowl because of how casually it delivered the threat underneath it. Maddie's hands didn't shake pouring the coffee, though it took everything she had to keep them steady. "I think you've had enough coffee," she said evenly, setting the pot down. "The check's on the house. I'd like you both to leave." The man's smile widened, not friendlier, just wider. "That's not very hospitable, sweetheart." "I'm not feeling very hospitable," Maddie said. "Get out." Neither of them moved right away, and for one long, suspended moment, Maddie felt the old fear rise up in her, the instinct to soften the words, to apologize, to make herself smaller so the moment would pass more easily. She didn't do it. She stood behind the counter with her chin up and her arms crossed, and she waited. The bell over the door chimed. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She felt it in the way the 2 men at the counter went suddenly, visibly still, the heavy-set one's hand freezing halfway to his coffee cup. "Gentlemen," Enzo said, unbuttoning his coat as he walked toward the counter with the unhurried gait of a man arriving for his usual breakfast, though it was well past 2 in the afternoon. "I don't believe I've seen either of you in here before." "Just passing through," the heavy-set man said, though the confidence had drained noticeably out of his voice. "That's interesting," Enzo said, sliding onto the stool beside them, close enough that the message was unmistakable without a single raised voice. Because Marcus tells me you've asked quite a lot of specific questions for a couple of men just passing through. Health permits, fire inspections, insurance. He turned his head slightly, and though Maddie couldn't see his face from where she stood, she could see the way both men shrank back a fraction of an inch, the way people did around something they'd suddenly, belatedly recognized as dangerous. Those are strange things to be curious about, unless you're planning on causing a problem for this diner. Are you planning on causing a problem for this diner? No, the heavyset man said quickly. No problem. We were just leaving. I think that's a good idea, Enzo said pleasantly. The two men left cash on the counter, far more than the coffee and untouched pie were worth, and hurried out the door without looking back. The bell chimed sharply behind them, and the diner exhaled, the low murmur of the other customers picking back up like nothing had happened at all. Maddie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands finally trembling now that the danger, or the appearance of it, had passed. Enzo turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral, though something tight had settled behind his eyes. Vance sent them, he said. It wasn't a question. I don't know, Maddie admitted. Maybe. They didn't say. They didn't have to. Enzo's jaw tightened just slightly, a flicker of something harder passing across his face before he smoothed it back into calm. I'll handle it. You don't have to handle everything, Maddie said, though her voice came out softer than she meant it to, less like an objection and more like an admission that she was tired, that some part of her wanted very much for someone to handle it. I know I don't have to, Enzo said. I want to. He held her gaze for a long moment, something steady and unshakable in his expression that made her chest go warm despite everything. You built something worth protecting, Maddie. That means something to me. Let me do this part. She didn't argue. She poured him a cup of coffee, even though it wasn't his usual hour and he hadn't asked for it, and he drank it slowly while she went back to work, and for the first time in days, the cold knot of unease in her stomach began, finally, to loosen. Sunday came gray and quiet, rain tapping lightly against the diner's front windows in the hour before opening. Maddie had closed early the night before to give herself time to prepare, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was preparing for. She'd set up 2 cups of coffee at the corner booth, Bianca's usual seat from when they were kids and their grandmother would let them sit there after school doing homework while the dinner rush thundered around them, and she waited, wiping down the same clean counter 3 times because her hands needed something to do. Bianca arrived a few minutes past 10, shaking rain off her umbrella at the door, looking smaller somehow than she had a week ago, less armored. She sat down across from Maddie without any of her usual polish, without the crisp opening line Maddie had half braced herself for, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. I talked to a lawyer, Bianca said finally, about the letter of intent. It's rescinded, fully. I made sure of it myself, didn't leave it to Preston's people. Okay, Maddie said. I also talked to someone else, Bianca continued, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. A therapist. First session was Thursday. I've been putting it off for years, if you want to know the truth. I told myself I didn't need it, that I just needed to work harder, be more successful, prove I was worth something. It took almost losing this place, and almost losing you, to make me actually sit in the chair. Maddie studied her sister's face, looking for the old performance, the rehearsed confidence, and finding, for maybe the first time in years, something that looked like plain honesty instead. I'm sorry, Bianca said. I know that doesn't undo it. I know I tried to sell the one thing that actually meant something to you, the thing Nona trusted you with, without even having the decency to ask. I told myself it was for the family, for Mom's medical bills, for both of us. But that's not really true. It was for me. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be the one who saved us, because I've never once in my life felt like I was the one who saved anything. You could have talked to me, Maddie said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words. 3 years of accumulated hurt finally finding a crack to leak through. Instead of just deciding I was going to be another line item you managed. You just cook, Maddie. Do you know how many times you've said that to me? Like it was nothing. Like everything I do here is nothing. I know, Bianca said, and her eyes were wet now, no performance left in them at all. I said it because I was jealous. You found the thing you were good at before you were even old enough to drive, and I never found mine, and it was easier to make you small than to admit how big that made me feel, standing next to you. She wiped roughly at her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I know that's not how this works. I just wanted you to know I see it now, all of it. Maddie reached across the table and covered her sister's hand with her own, the gesture surprising them both. I don't forgive you today, she said honestly. But I want to. That's something, isn't it? It's more than I deserve, Bianca said, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they sat together in the corner booth of Rosa's kitchen and simply talked. No performance, no armor, just two sisters slowly finding their way back to something that had been buried under years of misunderstanding and grief neither of them had known how to carry alone. The bell over the door chimed sometime later, and Maddie looked up to see Enzo standing in the entrance, shaking rain from his coat, his eyes moving from Bianca to Maddie with a quiet question in them that he didn't voice aloud. Maddie gave him a small nod, a silent, all right, and he took it without comment, settling into his usual booth by the window as though he hadn't noticed anything unusual at all, though Maddie caught the small, careful way he kept glancing over, making sure. It became a kind of ritual after that. Bianca started coming by on Sundays, not to talk business, but to sit in the corner booth and slowly, awkwardly, learn how to be a sister again. She was terrible in the kitchen, exactly as terrible as she'd always claimed, burning toast with an impressive consistency that made even Marcus wince. But she showed up, week after week, and that counted for something Maddie hadn't realized she'd been starving for. Enzo kept coming too, 5 mornings a week, same booth, same order, though something had shifted in the easy quiet between him and Maddie, a warmth that neither of them had named, but both of them had started, quietly, to lean into. He lingered longer after his coffee now. He asked her questions about the diner's history, about Rosa, about the recipes, and he listened in a way that made Maddie feel, for the first time in years, like the work she did mattered beyond the plates it produced. One evening in early autumn, after the dinner rush had cleared and the last regulars had drifted home into the cooling dark, Maddie found him still sitting in his booth long after his usual departure time, a folder of his own sitting on the table in front of him, considerably thinner than the one Preston Vance had once brought through her door. I have something for you, Enzo said, sliding the folder across the table as she wiped down the counter nearby. Before you say anything, it's not what it looks like. I'm not trying to buy anything from you. Maddie wiped her hands on her apron and opened the folder cautiously. Inside was a single document, a deed transfer, the language dense with legal terms she didn't fully understand, but the gist of which became clear within the first paragraph. The note on Rosa's kitchen, the one Enzo had quietly held for 3 years, forgiven in full, the building and everything in it released free and clear into Maddie's name alone. I don't understand, Maddie said, staring at the paper. I told you I'd protect this place, Enzo said. I meant it, but I've been thinking, and I don't want you carrying a debt to me, even a friendly one, even one I never intended to collect on. I want you to own this place outright. No note, no leverage, no strings, just yours, the way your grandmother wanted it to be. Maddie looked up at him, her throat tight. This is worth a lot of money, Enzo. It's worth exactly what your grandmother's trust in me was worth, he said simply. I told her I'd see this place still standing for whichever granddaughter earned it. You earned it. I'm just making sure the paperwork agrees. Why does this matter so much to you? Maddie asked, and the question came out more honest than she'd intended. Less about the deed, and more about the year that had passed, the quiet mornings, the way he'd looked at Bianca with something like understanding instead of judgment, the way he looked at Maddie now, like she was the most interesting thing in any room he ever walked into. Enzo was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave everything. Because I've spent most of my life in rooms where people take things, he said finally. Businesses, loyalty, silence. I'm good at that world, Maddie. I didn't build it, but I inherited it, and I've made my peace with what it requires of me. But this place, he gestured around the quiet diner, the worn booths, the chalkboard menu still bearing Maddie's handwriting from the morning's specials. This place is the opposite of that. Nobody takes anything here. Your grandmother built it out of nothing but stubbornness and good food, and you've kept it alive with your own 2 hands, asking nothing from anyone. I like sitting in it. I like watching you work. It reminds me there's still a version of the world where things get built instead of taken. He paused, and something more vulnerable crept into his voice, something Maddie hadn't heard from him before. And selfishly, I suppose I like the excuse to keep coming back. Maddie felt her face flush warm, something fluttering behind her ribs that had nothing to do with the deed still sitting open on the counter between them. You don't need an excuse, she said quietly. You could just say you like the eggs. A slow smile spread across his face, the rare, unguarded kind she'd only seen a handful of times in the year she'd known him. The eggs are excellent, he agreed, but that's not really why I keep coming back, and I think you know that. I might, Maddie said, and found herself smiling too, something warm and nervous and entirely new unfolding in her chest. He stood, tucking his coat back on, though he paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart do something complicated and quick. Dinner, he said. Not here. Somewhere you don't have to cook. I'd like to take you, if you'll let me. Maddie set down the rag she'd been holding, wiping her hands slowly on her apron, buying herself a second to steady her voice. I'd like that, she said. Friday. I close early on Fridays. Friday, Enzo agreed, and the bell chimed softly behind him as he stepped out into the cooling evening, leaving Maddie standing alone in the quiet diner with a deed to her grandmother's legacy in her hands, and a warmth in her chest she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could remember. The months that followed unfolded slowly, the way real things do, without the dramatic sweep of a single decisive moment, but through 100 small ones instead. Maddie and Enzo's Friday dinners became a fixture, quiet, unhurried evenings at small restaurants across town where nobody recognized either of them, and the conversation ranged from her grandmother's recipes to his complicated relationship with the family business he'd inherited, a business he was, she came to understand, slowly and deliberately steering towards something cleaner, something he could hand down without the weight he'd carried inheriting it himself. Bianca kept showing up on Sundays, and somewhere around the 4th month, she finally admitted, over a cup of coffee and a slice of pie she'd actually managed to eat without setting off the smoke detector, that she'd quit her job at the investment firm and was considering something smaller, something that let her use the parts of herself that actually felt honest. She started helping with the diner's books, a job that suited her far better than the kitchen ever would, and slowly, carefully, the sisters built something that looked less like the strained politeness of their childhood and more like an actual friendship, hard-won and imperfect and real. Preston Vance never came back to town. Word filtered through eventually, the way it always did in a place small enough that everyone knew everyone's business 3 days before they admitted to knowing it, that Vance Capital Partners had quietly shelved its plans to expand into regional food licensing after a series of complications nobody could quite explain. Complications that involved permits mysteriously stalling and investors mysteriously losing interest, and a reputation that had, for reasons nobody could pin down, become suddenly and thoroughly toxic in every circle that mattered to a man like him. Maddie never asked Enzo directly whether he'd had a hand in it. She suspected she already knew the answer, and some part of her, she was surprised to discover, wasn't entirely bothered by that. On a bright Sunday morning, nearly a year after the day Bianca had walked into the diner with a leather folder and a stranger's business card, Maddie stood behind the counter of Rosa's kitchen, watching the sun come up gold through the front windows, the smell of biscuits and browned butter thick in the warm air. Her grandmother's notebook sitting open on the counter beside her, its pages soft and worn from a year of new use. New notes added in Maddie's careful handwriting alongside Rosa's fading cursive. Bianca sat in the corner booth doing the week's books, glasses pushed up into her hair, and Enzo sat in his usual seat by the window, with the newspaper folded neatly beside his plate, watching Maddie with the quiet, steady attention that had become as familiar to her as the smell of her own kitchen. "You know," Bianca said without looking up from the ledger, "Nona would have liked him." Maddie glanced toward Enzo's booth, where he caught her eye and offered a small, private smile that belonged only to her. "I think she already did," Maddie said. "I think that's why she trusted him with the note in the first place." "Smart woman," Bianca said, and for once, there was no bitterness in it at all, only the easy warmth of a sister who had finally, slowly, learned how to be proud of something without needing to own it first. Maddie wiped her hands on her apron, closed the notebook gently, and carried a fresh cup of coffee across the dining room to the corner booth by the window, the same booth Enzo had claimed the very first morning he ever walked through that door, back before either of them had understood what they were building. She set the cup down in front of him and slid into the seat across from him without being asked, something she wouldn't have dared to do a year ago, something that felt, now, as natural as breathing. "You said it once," Maddie said. "You told my sister I wasn't just cooking, that it was a business asset with a face and a name." "I remember," Enzo said. "I've been thinking about that a lot this year," Maddie said. "About what it means to build something instead of taking it. My grandmother did that. I've tried to do it too. I think, somewhere along the way, without either of us really planning it, we started building something together." Enzo reached across the table and covered her hand with his thumb tracing slowly, gently, over her knuckles. "I noticed," he said, and his voice had gone soft in a way she rarely heard from him, the careful, guarded man from that first morning almost entirely gone now, replaced by someone who let himself be seen. "I noticed the very first morning, if I'm honest. I just didn't know how to say it without frightening you off." "You could have just said the eggs were excellent," Maddie said, echoing his own words back to him, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "The eggs are excellent," Enzo agreed, lifting her hand to press a light kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you already know that's not why I keep coming back." Outside, the neon sign buzzed its familiar half-second stutter before catching light, and the morning regulars began to trickle in one by one through the door Rosa Sullivan had first propped open in 1979 with nothing but a cast-iron skillet and a stubborn belief that good food, honestly made, was worth more than anything anyone could ever put a price on. Maddie Sullivan sat in the corner booth with her hand in Enzo's, watching her sister balance the books at the next table over, and understood, finally, completely, that her grandmother had been right about all of it. Some things weren't for sale. Some things were only ever meant to be built, one honest morning at a time, by the people who loved them enough to stay. Maddie never did take the $5 million. Not that year, and not in any of the years that followed. Not when Bianca eventually found her footing running the diner's books and expansion plans with a steadiness that surprised them both. Not when Rose's Kitchen quietly became one of the most beloved breakfast spots in 3 counties, without ever once selling out a single recipe to a boxed mix or a national chain. She kept the notebook in the fireproof box under the register, its pages growing thicker every year with new additions in her own careful hand. And every morning before the sun came up, she stood in the same kitchen her grandmother had built, cooking the same recipes with the same care, no longer just cooking at all, but keeping something alive that no amount of money could ever have bought in the first place. What started as a sister's cruel dismissal turned into the truest thing Maddie Sullivan ever built, a family restored, a legacy protected, and a love story that began over 2 eggs, over easy, in the corner booth by the window. If Maddie's story reminded you that the quiet ones are sometimes the strongest, and that some things really are worth more than $5 million, let us know what you think in the comments below. Would you have made the same choice Maddie did? Or would the money have been too hard to walk away from? If this slow burn, heartfelt mafia romance moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who still believes in family, and subscribe for more stories where love is built one honest morning at a time. See you in the next one.